The war was already lost. The enemy was everywhere. A once mighty fleet reduced to drifting wreckage. Planets burned, defenses crumbled, and the last remnants of a once proud alliance prepared for the inevitable: surrender or extinction. No reinforcements were coming. No miraculous turnaround was on the horizon. The battle was over. Until something changed. A single unexpected signal cracked through the void. It wasn't an enemy broadcast. It wasn't a distress call. It was a warning, but not for the defenders. The invaders had made a mistake, a fatal one. Because now, something else had entered the battlefield. Something the enemy had never faced before. A human warship. Every great journey starts with a few brave explorers. Right now, HFY Chronicles-849 is just beginning, and your support means everything. If you enjoy unraveling the mysteries of the universe, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us grow this community together. The Zeltheris Dominion had never lost a war. Not once. For centuries, their empire had expanded, devouring weaker civilizations, turning entire species into servants, and eliminating anyone who resisted. They were methodical, precise, unstoppable. Every invasion followed the same pattern: overwhelming force, rapid strikes, complete subjugation. And this time was no different. The Gendaris Republic had fought hard, but they were outmatched from the beginning. Their fleets were technologically inferior, their strategies predictable, their defenses obsolete. The Zeltheris warlords had already begun discussing how they would divide the spoils. The war was over, or so they thought. Then came the human distress signal. An automated beacon. A last-ditch message from a desperate Gendaris commander. It wasn't meant for anyone in particular. Just a final call for help. A futile whisper into the void. And yet, someone answered. A single ship. Just one. But not just any ship. A human warship. The UNS Valkyrie. The Zeltheris dismissed it immediately. A single vessel against an armada? Insignificant. A nuisance at best. But they had no idea what they were dealing with. For centuries, humanity had remained a mystery to the larger galactic community. They were isolated, distant, uninterested in empire building or expansionist warfare. Other species saw them as unpredictable, reckless, and dangerously innovative. But those who studied them closely saw something else, an unsettling pattern. In human history, every time they had been underestimated, someone had paid the price. Every time they were pushed to the brink, they pushed back harder. And when they went to war, it was never just a battle. It was an extinction event for their enemies. The UNS Valkyrie was no ordinary ship. It was an experimental war machine, a vessel designed not just for combat but for total domination of any battlefield. Armed with next-generation AI-assisted targeting, railguns that fired projectiles at a fraction of the speed of light, and a reactor core capable of powering a fleet on its own, it was a testament to humanity's brutal efficiency in warfare. Yet the most terrifying weapon it carried wasn't its firepower. It was its crew. Humans had an instinct that no other species seemed to understand: the ability to adapt under pressure, to turn a hopeless fight into a calculated victory, to look at an unwinnable situation and find the one razor-thin chance of survival. And in this moment, as the UNS Valkyrie hurtled toward the battlefield, its captain and crew were already calculating their next move. This wasn't a rescue mission. This wasn't a diplomatic attempt to de-escalate. The battle had already been lost. But now, it was time to turn the tide. The Zeltheris Dominion did not know fear. Their war doctrine was simple: overwhelm, crush, subjugate. Their species had perfected the art of warfare over centuries, their fleets numbering in the thousands, each vessel a technological marvel of destruction. Their soldiers were genetically optimized for battle, bred for strength, endurance, and absolute obedience. Against them, civilizations crumbled in weeks. Planets fell in days. The Gendaris Republic had lasted mere hours before their defenses shattered. And now, as the remnants of their fleet drifted among the wreckage of a once proud armada, their final screams still echoing in the void, the Zeltheris stood victorious. But for the first time in their history, something changed. It began as a ripple, a single, unremarkable distortion in the vast emptiness of space. The Dominion commanders barely acknowledged it. Their focus was on their next target, their warships already preparing for the final planetary bombardment that would erase Gendaris resistance completely. Then came the second distortion. A gravitational spike, brief but unmistakable. A ship had entered the battlefield. A single human vessel. The Zeltheris warlords scoffed. Humanity had never been a threat to them. A species of explorers, traders, and scientists. Not warriors. Not conquerors. Their fleets were small, their presence in the galactic theater insignificant. A single human warship meant nothing. And yet, something felt wrong. A Zeltheris battlesphere. The Dreadborn Eternal, the largest and most advanced warship in the fleet, locked onto the approaching vessel. Data flooded its processors. Ship classification, energy readings, projected threat, level. The results were confusing. The human warship was small, sleek, almost delicate in comparison to the hulking Dominion behemoths. No visible armor plating, no massive weapon emplacements. But its energy signature, that was something else entirely. It was pulsing with an intensity the Zeltheris had never seen. "Scan again," the warlord ordered, his voice laced with irritation. The results remained the same. The human ship carried the energy output of an entire fleet. The Dominion's arrogance faltered. They fired a warning shot, an electromagnetic burst meant to disable weaker ships, something that had brought down entire Gendaris battlecruisers in seconds. The human vessel didn't even flinch. Then, without warning, it accelerated. Not in a predictable linear trajectory, but in something the Zeltheris had never encountered before. An erratic, seemingly impossible pattern of movement. One moment, it was there, directly in their line of fire. The next, it was gone, reappearing at impossible angles. "This is not possible," one of the Dominion tacticians murmured. "No ship moves like that." But it did. The UNS Valkyrie wasn't just a warship. It was a statement, a testament to human ingenuity, to their willingness to go beyond the limits of conventional warfare. Its experimental gravitational drive allowed it to twist and fold space itself, slipping between dimensions for fractions of a second. To the enemy, it looked as if it were teleporting, flickering in and out of existence like a phantom. And then, it struck. A single kinetic round. Not an energy weapon, not a plasma bolt. A solid projectile, fired at near-light speed. The Zeltheris believed in shields, in energy barriers that could withstand direct bombardments for hours. But human weapons didn't rely on energy dissipation. They relied on physics. The round impacted the Dreadborn Eternal's outer hull. And in an instant, the entire warship crumpled inward. The kinetic force shattered bulkheads, sent ripples of destruction through its core. Secondary explosions erupted across its structure. The ship, the greatest war machine the Dominion had ever built, ceased to exist in the span of 5 seconds. Panic spread like wildfire. The Zeltheris had never seen anything like this before. They had faced thousands of species, conquered entire empires, and yet they had never encountered an enemy that ignored the rules of warfare. That defied logic. The human ship wasn't fighting like a traditional fleet. It was hunting. The Valkyrie twisted through the chaos, its weapons systematically targeting key enemy vessels. One after another, Dominion warships, each the size of cities, were torn apart. Not by overwhelming firepower, but by precision. Human warfare wasn't about brute force. It was about efficiency. Strike where it hurts. Cripple their ability to retaliate. Break them psychologically before the real assault begins. The Dominion tried to adapt. They ordered all warships to focus fire on the Valkyrie. Thousands of weapons discharged at once, the sheer firepower enough to melt moons. And yet, every shot missed. The Valkyrie danced through the carnage, slipping between laser barrages and missile salvos as if the battle had already been decided. And, in a way, it had. But what terrified the Zeltheris most wasn't the destruction. It wasn't the speed, the precision, or even the impossible technology. It was the silence. The humans never sent a message. No warnings. No declarations. No demands for surrender. They simply acted. For the first time in the history of the Dominion, the warlords felt something foreign to them. Something they had never considered possible. Doubt, because this was just one human warship. One. And it was winning. The battle had been lost. The Gendaris had been defeated. But now, the tide was turning. The battlefield was a graveyard of burning wreckage, the lifeless hulks of Gendaris warships drifting through the void. The Zeltharis Dominion had been moments away from sealing their latest conquest, wiping out the last traces of resistance. And yet, in the span of minutes, everything had changed. The UNS Valkyrie was rewriting the rules of war. Inside the Dominion, Command Vessel, Supreme Warlord Zentharak watched in stunned silence as one of his greatest warships, the Dreadborn Eternal, vanished in an instant, torn apart by a single kinetic strike. The data coming in from his tactical officers was incomprehensible. The human warship's speed defied physics. Its weapons ignored every known form of shielding. Its movements were unreadable, unpredictable. "This is impossible," one of his strategists hissed, mandibles clicking nervously. "No vessel is this fast. No species fights like this." Yet, there it was. The Valkyrie wasn't engaging them in a traditional battle. The Zeltharis were used to wars of attrition, pitting massive fleets against each other, hammering their enemies into submission through sheer overwhelming force. The humans, however, they had no interest in attrition. They were predators. The Valkyrie moved like a phantom, appearing behind Dominion warships without warning, striking with surgical precision. It didn't waste time attacking shields head-on. It slipped between their defenses, striking at structural weak points, rupturing fuel lines, destabilizing reactors. Ships that should have lasted hours in sustained combat were falling in seconds. A Dominion battlecruiser, the Iron Fang, attempted a counterattack. Unleashing a barrage of high-energy plasma bolts, the Valkyrie twisted impossibly, accelerating into a tight spiral, dodging every shot with a precision that should have been impossible for something so large. Before the Iron Fang could adjust its targeting systems, a railgun round tore through its primary thrusters. The impact didn't destroy the vessel immediately, but it didn't need to. The kinetic shockwave rippled through the ship's superstructure, causing stress fractures across its hull. Then came the second shot. The Iron Fang detonated from within, its ammunition stores igniting in a cascade of secondary explosions. The surrounding Dominion warships faltered, their formation breaking apart as their commanders scrambled to process what was happening. This wasn't war. This was annihilation. The Zeltharis were not an easily frightened species. They had dominated the stars for centuries, crushed countless civilizations beneath their heel. But as ship after ship crumbled under the relentless assault of this single human warship, something spread through their ranks. Something their kind had never truly felt before. A deep, gnawing fear. "Send all remaining forces at the human vessel," Warlord Zentharak bellowed, his voice tinged with the first signs of desperation. "Overwhelm it, no matter the cost." Across the battlefield, Dominion warships realigned their formations, hundreds of vessels converging on the Valkyrie from all directions. Beams of searing energy lit up the void, missile swarms streaking through the darkness, targeting the lone human warship. The sheer volume of firepower should have turned the Valkyrie into debris within seconds, but it didn't. The Valkyrie vanished, not in the conventional sense. It didn't accelerate out of range. It didn't deploy countermeasures. It simply ceased to be where it had been. The Zeltharis tracking systems scrambled to locate it, sensors sweeping the area, searching for any sign of its energy signature. And then, in the blink of an eye, it reappeared. Not where they expected, not where they had targeted. But inside their formation, the Dominion fleet had unknowingly encircled themselves. The human warship struck like a blade, its railguns firing at point-blank range, tearing through multiple vessels in a single sweep. Swarms of autonomous drones deployed from hidden compartments, weaving through enemy ships with unsettling precision. The drones weren't traditional fighters. They didn't engage in dogfights. They hunted, slipping through armor gaps, burrowing into vital systems before detonating. Explosions rippled through the Dominion fleet. Warships collided in the confusion, unable to maneuver out of each other's way. Their overwhelming numbers became a liability, their own formations trapping them. The humans were not simply fighting the Zeltheris, they were outthinking them. For the first time in the Dominion's history, their war machine was collapsing not from external force, but from internal chaos. Command signals were lost in the panic. Orders became incoherent. Entire battle groups hesitated, unsure whether to advance or retreat, and the humans exploited every second of that hesitation. The Valkyrie fired its main weapon, not a missile, not an energy beam, but something far worse, a kinetic lance, a projectile, composed of exotic matter, accelerated to near relativistic speeds. Its impact force equivalent to an extinction-level asteroid strike. It didn't explode, it simply erased. The kinetic lance struck the largest remaining Dominion warship, the unyielding Wrath, with the force of a god's wrath. The ship didn't just break apart, it disintegrated, its atoms scattered into the void. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. For the first time in Dominion history, a fleet-wide retreat order was issued. The remaining warships, battle-hardened veterans of countless conquests, turned and fled. The war was over, but the humans weren't done, because the Valkyrie didn't come alone. The Zeltheris had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed this was just one ship, acting alone. But in the distance beyond the remains of the battlefield, space itself twisted. Dozens of gravitational distortions flared into existence. More human warships were arriving. And this time, they weren't just here to win the battle, they were here to end the war. Warlord Zentharak had never known fear before today. His species did not feel it the way lesser beings did. The Zeltheris Dominion had been built on a foundation of absolute certainty. Certainty in their superiority, their invincibility, their divine right to rule the stars. That certainty had died the moment the Valkyrie arrived. And now, as his forces scrambled in panicked retreat, his mind raced to comprehend the impossible truth unfolding before him. The humans were not supposed to be this. His empire had studied them, dismissed them. Yes, they were adaptable. Yes, they fought with a viciousness unbecoming of a so-called civilized species. But they were a young race. Barely a footnote in the grand chronicles of the Galactic Order. Their technology was supposed to be centuries behind. Their fleets should have been nothing more than an irritation before the might of the Dominion. And yet, as Zentharak stared into the abyss of space, he saw the future of the Zeltheris shatter before his very eyes. The Valkyrie was no longer alone. Gravitational anomalies flickered across the void, each one a tear in space-time, as reality itself seemed to fold inward. The Dominion's remaining sensors scrambled to identify the signatures. First one, then three, then dozens. Each disturbance heralded the arrival of another human warship, emerging from some unseen dimension beyond the reach of Dominion physics. Zentharak clenched his mandibles. "How many?" he demanded, his voice sharp, desperate. A nearby officer trembled. 57, and more still coming. 57 human warships. A single vessel had turned the tide of battle. Now, the floodgates had opened. The Dominion fleet, once the undisputed force in this sector of space, was now outnumbered, outgunned, outmatched. Their only choice was to retreat, to flee back to their strongholds and regroup. But even as Zentharak prepared to issue the order, something stopped him. A transmission, not from his own fleet, from them. The humans had not spoken a single word throughout the battle. They had not issued ultimatums, not demanded surrender. They had simply arrived and unleashed destruction. But now, at the precipice of their overwhelming victory, they had something to say. Zeltheris command. The voice was calm, unshaken. Unyielding, it carried no malice, no rage, just cold certainty. "This is Admiral Elias Voss of the UNS Valkyrie. You have 5 minutes to surrender all remaining forces. Any vessel that remains in this system past that time will cease to exist." The channel cut off. 5 minutes. Zentharak's claws twitched. "They dare demand our surrender?" He turned to his remaining fleet commanders, seeking reinforcement of his own fury. "We are the Dominion. We do not bow to primitive. They are not primitive." The voice belonged to High Strategist Veklan, his most trusted military advisor. Unlike the others, Veklan had not spent the battle hissing in denial. He had watched, observed, analyzed, and what he saw had shaken him to his very core. "They fight like nothing we have ever faced," Veklan continued, his deep-set eyes dark with grim realization. "They do not rely on brute force, nor even superior numbers. They adapt. They evolve within the battle. Their tactics shift moment to moment, always unpredictable, always one step ahead. We have studied the galaxy for centuries, yet they—" He gestured to the growing swarm of human warships, their formation tightening like a predator ready for the kill. "Have rewritten the very concept of war in a single engagement." Zentharak recoiled, his exoskeletal plating tightening. "We still have ships. We have ruins," Veklan snapped. "Our weapons cannot touch them. Our shields cannot stop them. Our formations are crumbling, and our soldiers fear them." He leaned closer, his voice a whisper now. "You know what this means." Zentharak knew. To surrender was unthinkable. To flee was shameful. But to fight on, to fight was to die. His mind spiraled, searching for alternatives. If they retreated, they could warn the High Command, regroup, gather more fleets, more resources, more. A new warning flashed across the command console. More human ships had arrived. 74 now, then 80, then 93. Their window for retreat was closing. The humans had not come to win a single battle. They had come to end the war forever. Zentharak's limbs shook, rage and disbelief warring within him. Every instinct, every fiber of his being screamed to fight, to defy. But the cold, brutal reality before him left no room for pride. He turned to his officers, his voice hollow. "Signal the fleet." He did not say the word, could not bring himself to form the syllables. But the meaning was clear. The Zeltheris Dominion, for the first time in its long, brutal history, was surrendering. The Zeltheris Dominion had ruled the stars for centuries, their empire stretching across entire sectors, consuming lesser civilizations with ruthless efficiency. They had crushed rebellions, annihilated fleets, and rewritten the destiny of countless species with a single order from their war councils. But never, not once, had they surrendered. And yet, as Warlord Zentharak stood in the dim glow of his failing flagship's command chamber, watching his fleet crumble in real time, he saw no other choice. "This is Warlord Zentharak," he growled into the transmission channel. The words tasted like poison. "To all remaining Dominion forces, stand down." For a long, excruciating moment, silence hung over the battlefield. The Zeltheris war doctrine had no precedent for surrender. Their soldiers, their commanders, they had been bred to fight, to die before yielding. And yet, as the message rippled through the Dominion ranks, something terrifying became clear. They were afraid, not just of death, not just of defeat, afraid of them, the humans, the ones who had rewritten the rules of engagement, who had turned a hopeless rout into an overwhelming victory within minutes of their arrival, who now held dominion over this battlefield, not through sheer numbers, not through brute force, but through something far more terrifying. They fought like they knew the future. It wasn't just that the Valkyrie and its fleet had better weapons. It wasn't just their bizarre, almost supernatural ability to phase in and out of real space as if physics were nothing more than an inconvenience. It was their decisions, the way they countered every move before it was even made, the way they adapted to each strategy before the Dominion even knew it was failing. They anticipated maneuvers before they happened. They fired weapons before the enemy was even in position. They struck from angles no one had thought possible. It was as if they had already fought this battle before, and won. Zentharak's transmission was answered moments later. The screen flickered, and for the first time, he saw the face of his enemy, Admiral Elias Voss. The human commander was older than Zentharak had expected, his features carved from years of warfare. The lines around his steel-gray eyes weren't just from age. They were from experience, from battles fought not just with firepower, but with mind and will. He carried no arrogance, no visible satisfaction at the surrender of an empire's fleet. Only quiet certainty. Zentharak loathed him instantly. "Your surrender is acknowledged," Voss said, his voice even. "Your remaining vessels will power down weapons and submit to boarding procedures." Zentharak bared his fangs. "You have won a battle. Do not mistake it for the end of a war." Voss regarded him with the cold patience of a man who had heard that sentiment before. "I think you already know," he said quietly, "that this is the end." Zentharak's mandibles twitched. "Do you truly believe the Dominion can be broken so easily?" He forced a sneer. "You are still young. You do not know how deep our roots run." Voss didn't flinch. Deep roots don't matter when the ground beneath them has turned to ash. And with that, the transmission ended. Zentharak's claws curled into fists. The warlord turned away from the screen, his rage burning in silence. His people, his empire, had been beaten by an enemy they had barely considered worth preparing for. And as he looked back to the battlefield, to the dozens, hundreds of human ships now encircling his fleet like vultures around a dying beast, he felt something he had never known before. Not anger, not hatred, not vengeance. Doubt. What if Voss was right? What if this was the end? Not just for this battle, but for the Dominion itself. Across the battlefield, the remaining Dominion ships complied one by one, their weapons powering down, their engines ceasing their desperate attempts to flee. Human warships moved into formation, surrounding the remaining Dominion forces with precise, practiced efficiency. On the bridge of the UNS Valkyrie, Admiral Voss watched the displays with an expression of quiet focus. Around him, his officers worked with the smooth rhythm of a crew that had already predicted every possible outcome. And in truth, they had. Because this battle had been decided long before the first shot was fired. The UNS Valkyrie was not just a warship. It was not just an advanced piece of human engineering. It was something else entirely. Something the galaxy had never seen before. A ship that had already fought this battle, before it even began. The secret was buried deep within, the classified archives of Earth's military, hidden beneath layers of encryption and misdirection. Only a handful of humans even knew the full extent of the technology behind the Valkyrie. But in truth, it was simple. The ship could see the future, not in the way of mystics or prophets, but through something far more terrifying. It was called the Tachyon Synchronization Array, a device that allowed the Valkyrie to pull fragments of information from microseconds ahead in time, enough to know where an enemy ship would be before it arrived, enough to predict which shields would falter, which weapons would misfire, which weaknesses could be exploited before they were even revealed. To the Dominion, it had looked like magic. To humanity, it was just the next step in warfare. Voss sighed, running a hand over his face as he turned to his second-in-command. "Begin recovery operations. I want every Dominion ship boarded and secured within the next 2 hours." His officer nodded. "And their command ships?" Voss glanced at the readouts. The remaining Dominion fleet was a shadow of its former self, crippled, leaderless, broken. For the first time in centuries, the Ziltharis Dominion had been defeated, and the war was no longer theirs to fight. Voss exhaled slowly. "We take them in," the officer blinked. "You mean, you're keeping them alive?" Voss didn't answer immediately. He stared out the viewport at the remains of a battlefield that should have been a slaughter, yet had ended with an empire on its knees. Finally, he turned back. "There's no use killing a species that's already extinct," he murmured. The officer paled slightly at the implication. Because Voss wasn't just talking about this battle, he was talking about the Dominion itself. They didn't know it yet, but they were already dead. A deep silence hung over the remains of the battlefield, punctuated only by the distant echoes of dying flames and the soft hum of human warships locking. Down the last of the Dominion vessels, the once glorious fleet of the Ziltharis Dominion, an armada that had ruled the stars without challenge, now drifted in quiet surrender. But the weight of what had just occurred was still sinking in. On board the UNS Valkyrie, Admiral Elias Voss watched as reports flowed in from across the battlefield. Dominion commanders were being taken into custody, their ships boarded by precision strike teams that moved with the cold efficiency of seasoned veterans. Crew members who resisted were subdued. Those who cooperated were spared, an act of mercy that was likely incomprehensible to the Ziltharis, a species that had never left survivors in their wake. It was almost poetic. The Dominion had always prided itself on being the ultimate predator in the cosmos. It consumed, dominated, and erased any species that stood in its way. But today, it had encountered something far worse, something it could not comprehend. Voss turned to his second-in-command, Captain Naomi Richter, who was reviewing the latest intelligence feeds. Her sharp blue eyes flicked across the data, absorbing every detail with a practiced ease. "They still don't understand what happened," she murmured, shaking her head. "Their officers keep demanding to know how we did it, how we knew their every move." Voss exhaled slowly. Because to them, this battle made no sense. It was true. The tachyon synchronization array aboard the Valkyrie had given humanity an advantage so overwhelming that the battle had almost seemed predetermined. Every time a Dominion ship moved to flank, the humans were already waiting. Every time their weapons locked on, the humans had already shifted out of range. It was more than strategy, more than superior tactics, it was inevitability. But the true horror for the Dominion wasn't just that they had lost. It was that they had lost before they even began fighting. Richter frowned. "What do you think will happen now?" Voss glanced at the shattered remains of the Dominion fleet outside the viewport. The war was supposed to be unwinnable. The Dominion's strength was unchallenged. And yet, here they were. It would send shockwaves through the galaxy. Around him, his officers worked with the smooth rhythm of a crew that had already predicted every possible outcome. And in truth, they had. Because this battle had been decided long before the first shot was fired. The UNS Valkyrie was not just a warship. It was not just an advanced piece of human engineering. It was something else entirely. Something the galaxy had never seen before. A ship that had already fought this battle, before it even began. The secret was buried deep within, the classified archives of Earth's military, hidden beneath layers of encryption and misdirection. Only a handful of humans even knew the full extent of the technology behind the Valkyrie. But in truth, it was simple. The ship could see the future. Not in the way of mystics or prophets, but through something far more terrifying. It was called the Tachyon Synchronization Array, a device that allowed the Valkyrie to pull fragments of information from microseconds ahead in time, enough to know where an enemy ship would be before it arrived, enough to predict which shields would falter, which weapons would misfire, which weaknesses could be exploited before they were even revealed. To the Dominion, it had looked like magic. To humanity, it was just the next step in warfare. Voss sighed, running a hand over his face as he turned to his second-in-command. "Begin recovery operations. I want every Dominion ship boarded and secured within the next 2 hours." His officer nodded. "And their command ships?" Voss glanced at the readouts. The remaining Dominion fleet was a shadow of its former self. Crippled, leaderless, broken. For the first time in centuries, the Ziltharis Dominion had been defeated, and the war was no longer theirs to fight. Voss exhaled slowly. "We take them in." The officer blinked. "You mean you're keeping them alive?" Voss didn't answer immediately. He stared out the viewport, at the remains of a battlefield that should have been a slaughter, yet had ended with an empire on its knees. Finally, he turned back. "There's no use killing a species that's already extinct," he murmured. The officer paled slightly at the implication. Because Voss wasn't just talking about this battle. He was talking about the Dominion itself. They didn't know it yet, but they were already dead. For centuries, the Ziltharis Dominion had been the unshakable pillar of power in this sector. Entire species had bent the knee before them, surrendering their sovereignty to avoid extinction. They had been an empire of fear, ruling not just with weapons, but with the certainty that resistance was futile. But now, that certainty had been shattered. Voss turned away from the viewport, his gaze darkening. "The Dominion doesn't know it yet," he said, "but their empire just died today." Richter hesitated. "You think they'll collapse completely?" Voss nodded. "Without their military dominance, their entire foundation crumbles. The species they've conquered will see this as their chance to rise up. Their enemies will push into their territories. The political infighting will tear them apart from the inside. His voice lowered. They don't need us to finish them. They'll do it themselves. A chill settled over the command deck. Because it was true. The Dominion had ruled through fear. But fear was a fragile thing. The moment it was broken, the illusion of power fell apart. The cracks had already begun to form. On the Dominion flagship, the Zerthol Vengeance, Warlord Zentharak stood frozen in disbelief. The once proud commander of the Dominion's greatest fleet, a warlord whose name had struck terror into countless civilizations, was now nothing more than a defeated relic of a dying empire. His warriors, some of the finest ever bred, stood at his back, watching the enemy swarm through the wreckage of their armada. Many refused to accept it. Some still clung to the hope that this was a temporary setback, that the Dominion's might would recover, that the humans had merely been lucky. But Zentharak knew better. He had seen it. He had witnessed, firsthand, the way the humans had moved, the way they had countered every strategy, every maneuver, as if they had lived this battle before, and in a way, they had. Their ship had glimpsed the future. Even now, standing among the ruins of his great fleet, Zentharak felt something he had never known before. Not anger, not hatred, something deeper, something far more dangerous. Doubt. What if the humans weren't just another species clawing their way to dominance? What if they were something more? Something inevitable? His claws tightened against the steel railing. The Dominion had crushed civilizations, wiped entire species from existence, burned planets to nothing but cinders. They had never hesitated, never faltered, and yet, in the span of mere hours, humanity had undone centuries of Dominion supremacy. Zentharak's breath was slow and heavy as he turned to his officers. "The war is over," he muttered. The words felt foreign in his mouth. His subordinates shifted uncomfortably, their mandibles clicking in protest. "You cannot mean—" "I mean exactly what I said." His eyes flickered with something almost resigned. "The Dominion's reign is finished." He let the words settle over them. The truth was undeniable, and as the Dominion ships powered down, their weapons falling silent, the realization spread like wildfire. They had lost, and worse still, they had lost to an enemy who had already seen this moment coming. Back aboard the UNS Valkyrie, Voss stood in the heart of the command deck, his gaze fixed on the data streams confirming the Dominion's surrender. It was over. But deep in his gut, he knew this was only the beginning. The galaxy had been watching this battle. Word would spread like wildfire. The invincible Dominion had been brought to its knees in a single battle, not by numbers, not by brute force, but by something far more terrifying. Human ingenuity. The balance of power had just been rewritten, and there would be consequences. All, across the stars, empires, warlords, and rulers would be forced to ask themselves a terrifying question. If the humans could do this, what else were they capable of? The war may have been over, but for humanity, the real game had just begun. The Dominion surrender should have been the end of it. Across the battlefield, Zeltharis ships powered down, their weapons falling silent as their crews submitted to the inevitable. The UNS Valkyrie, standing as the harbinger of their doom, held position at the center of the wreckage, its hull barely scorched from the so-called greatest fleet in the galaxy. But Admiral Elias Voss knew better. Wars weren't just fought on battlefields. They were fought in the corridors of power, in the hearts of those who survived, and in the shadows of what came next. The destruction of the Dominion fleet was just the first ripple in a storm that would soon engulf the entire galaxy. The death of fear for centuries, the Zeltharis Dominion had been the singular force that kept order in this part of the universe. Not order through governance, not through alliances or diplomacy, but through sheer, unrelenting terror. They had made examples of species that resisted, leaving only smoldering ruins where civilizations once stood. They had not ruled through politics, but through certainty. Certainty that they could never be challenged, never be defeated. That certainty had just been shattered. As word spread of the battle, species that had lived in the Dominion's shadow for centuries began to awaken. What had once been whispered hopes of rebellion turned into open declarations of defiance. On conquered worlds, resistance groups that had spent generations in hiding rose up overnight. Supply chains broke down. Communications between Dominion sectors began to fail. The very heart of their empire, built upon fear, now pulsed with something far more dangerous: hope. And the moment hope was introduced into the equation, the Dominion was doomed. The humans had not merely won a battle. They had unmade an empire. The fall begins on the Dominion homeworld, Seltherus Prime. The War Council sat in stunned silence, watching the final battle unfold on replay screens. Before them, the tachyon synchronization array had been the key. Humanity's ability to predict and counter every move had left their warships invincible, their strategies untouchable. But that wasn't what had shaken the War Council to its core. It was something else. The cold, methodical efficiency of the human fleet. There had been no grand speeches, no hesitation, no offers for negotiation, no cries for mercy. The humans had not fought the Dominion. They had erased them. The War Council had seen many species rise against the Dominion before. Always the same story. They would scream defiance, claw for victory, hold on to the naive belief that they could challenge the greatest war machine in the galaxy. And then, inevitably, they would break. But humanity had never broken. Even as Dominion warlords had burned human colonies in the early days of the war, even when outnumbered, even when humanity had suffered losses that would have brought most species to their knees, the humans had not begged. They had studied. They had adapted. And when the time was right, they had ended the war in a single battle. Warlord Zentharak watched the recordings in silence. The images flickered on the screen before him. The Dominion fleet collapsing, the human warships cutting through their defenses with almost cruel precision. It should have been impossible, but the impossible had become reality. We underestimated them, one of the warlords murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Zentharak's mandibles clicked in frustration. No. We misunderstood them. The room fell into a tense silence. They do not fight for conquest, Zentharak continued, his gaze dark. They do not seek to rule. They do not revel in destruction. His claws tapped against the steel armrest of his throne. They fight to win. It was the most terrifying truth of all. Other species fought with passion, with desperation, with the fire of vengeance. Humans fought with purpose. When they waged war, they did not waste time with meaningless skirmishes or drawn-out campaigns. They ended wars, and they did it with a cold, relentless efficiency that even the Dominion had never seen before. The War Council members exchanged uneasy glances. What happens now? One of them asked hesitantly. Zentharak exhaled slowly. What happens now? He echoed, his voice hollow. Now, we pray they do not come for the rest of us. The dawn of a new galactic order. Back on the UNS Valkyrie, Admiral Voss sat in quiet contemplation as the aftershocks of the battle rippled through the stars. Humanity had emerged as the single most powerful force in the galaxy overnight. No longer just another fledgling species clawing its way toward relevance, no longer a footnote in galactic history. Now, every civilization in the universe knew their name, and they knew what it meant. The UNS Valkyrie was hailed as the savior of the battle, but in reality, it had been much more than that. It had been a declaration, a statement to every empire, every kingdom, every dominion that had ever looked at humanity and seen weakness. The message was clear. Humanity was not prey. They were the storm. Voss closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the fur ship around him. The war was over. The Dominion was finished, but the galaxy was watching, and there would be those who did not see humanity's victory as a warning, but as a challenge. The Admiral exhaled and turned his gaze back to the stars. There would be more wars to come, more battles, more enemies who refused to understand until it was too late. But for now, for the first time in history, the galaxy belonged to humanity. This is only the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. And if you want to hear more incredible tales like this, subscribe to HFY Chronicles-849. We're just getting started, and the universe is vast, dangerous, and filled with stories waiting to be told. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars.